I want you to close your eyes for just a moment and take a deep breath. Try to remember the very specific, comforting scent of sweet red paprika sizzling gently in warm pork fat. Can you hear the rhythmic, hollow sound of a wooden spoon scraping the bottom of a heavy, chipped enamel pot? Can you feel the warmth of the small kitchen radiating from the old tile stove while the winter wind howled outside the frosted windows? Today, we are taking a beautiful, nostalgic journey back to 1970s Hungary. We are going to rediscover 20 unforgettable, incredibly cheap foods we ate when our families had absolutely no money, but our hearts and bellies were somehow always full. These were the meals born out of absolute necessity, crafted by the magical, weathered hands of our grandmothers who knew how to turn water, flour, and potatoes into an absolute feast. Make sure you stay with me until the very end of this journey. The final dish we will remember together is a sweet, snowy white miracle that cost mere pennies to make, yet it felt like the greatest luxury a child could ever experience. Life in Hungary during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s flowed at a completely different pace than it does today. It was the era of goulash communism, a time when supermarket shelves were not lined with endless, overwhelming choices. Time itself seemed to move slower, without the frantic rushing and constant digital distractions that consume our modern world. Waiting was a natural part of life, whether we were waiting for the local baker to pull fresh bread from the oven, or simply waiting for Sunday to arrive so we could share a special meal with the entire extended family. There is a strange modern myth that because we lacked advanced technology and endless financial resources, our lives were somehow poorer or less vibrant. The absolute truth is the exact opposite. Because we had fewer material possessions, our daily human connections were infinitely deeper and richer. The small, crowded kitchen table was the center of our entire universe. It was there, over a steaming plate of the simplest, cheapest food imaginable, that we shared our deepest secrets, our loudest laughter, and our most genuine tears. We did not eat to consume quickly and move on. We ate to connect, to survive together, and to celebrate the quiet, modest beauty of simply being alive in each other's company. Let us begin our journey with the most iconic, unforgettable symbol of 1970s Hungarian childhood. I am talking about the legendary fat bread, affectionately known to all of us as zsíros kenyér. Imagine a tremendously thick, generous slice of fresh white bread, the kind with a dark, crusty edge that crunched so loudly and satisfyingly when you took your first bite. Our mothers or grandmothers would take a large spoonful of pure, snow-white pork fat, or sometimes precious goose fat if it was a special occasion, and spread it evenly across the soft, welcoming crumb. But the magic did not stop there. We would reach for the small metal tin of sweet red paprika, carefully dusting the glistening fat until the entire slice was covered in a beautiful, vibrant crimson layer. Finally, the sharp, pungent purple onions came into play. We would slice them thinly and press them firmly into the paprika. Eating this was a true communal ritual. We would run out into the street, clutching our carefully prepared slices, being so incredibly careful not to let the onion pieces fall onto the dusty road. We ate it while playing hide-and-seek in the fading afternoon light, the rich fat giving us endless energy, the sharp onions stinging our tongues in the most wonderful way. It cost almost nothing, yet it tasted like a glorious feast. Next, we must remember a dish that defined frugal ingenuity, the humble yet magnificent potato pasta, or krumplish testa. Whenever the money jar in the kitchen cupboard was completely empty before payday, this was the absolute savior. The ritual always began with the rhythmic sound of peeling potatoes, dropping them into a pot of salted water to boil until they were tender. In another heavy iron pot, chopped onions were slowly caramelized in a generous amount of fat until they turned a deep golden brown. We would then take the pot off the heat to stir in the sweet red paprika, ensuring it would not burn and turn bitter. The boiled potatoes were then smashed directly into this rich, fragrant onion and paprika base. Finally, the boiled square pasta was tossed into the mixture, stirred vigorously until every single noodle was coated in that savory, starchy, paprika-infused goodness. We always ate it piping hot, accompanied by a small glass dish of homemade pickled cucumbers or sour cabbage. The sharp, acidic crunch of the pickles cut perfectly through the heavy, comforting richness of the pasta. Sitting at the table, scraping the slightly crispy, caramelized bits from the bottom of the pot, we felt entirely satisfied, completely unaware of how cheap this incredible meal actually was. And now, let us transition to the gentle, sweet comfort of the evening. Can you still recall the warm, milky aroma of semolina pudding or teibegries slowly bubbling on the stove? This was the ultimate comfort food, a soothing embrace in a bowl after a long, exhausting day of school and play. The preparation required absolute patience and constant attention. The milk was brought to a gentle simmer, and the semolina had to be poured in a slow, steady stream while stirring continuously so it would not form unappetizing lumps. We watched closely as the liquid miraculously thickened into a rich, creamy porridge. But the true joy of this simple dish lay entirely in the topping. Once the steaming pudding was ladled into a deep porcelain plate, we were allowed to sprinkle a magical mixture of sweetened cocoa powder over the pristine white surface. We would sit and watch in pure fascination as the heat of the pudding slowly melted the cocoa and sugar, transforming it into a dark, sweet, glistening crust. Some children preferred to mix it all up immediately into a brown swirl, while others carefully ate the edges first, saving the thickest layer of chocolatey goodness for the final triumphant spoonful. Let us think back to those lazy, quiet Sunday mornings when nothing was ever allowed to go to waste. Bread that had gone completely hard and stale over the week found a glorious second life as savory Hungarian French toast, known to us as bundaskenyér. Throwing away bread was considered a profound sin in our households, an absolute disrespect to the labor that went into making it. Instead, those dry, unforgiving slices were dipped into a shallow bowl of beaten eggs, lightly salted and waiting to work their magic. The slices soaked up the egg, becoming heavy and soft once again, before being carefully lowered into a pan of bubbling, sizzling oil or fat. The smell that instantly filled the house was intoxicating. The bread would fry until the edges were incredibly crispy and golden brown, while the center remained tender, warm, and fluffy. The most crucial part of the ritual happened right after taking it out of the pan. While it was still dangerously hot, we would take a peeled clove of raw garlic and rub it vigorously over the crispy surface of the bread. Paired with a steaming mug of hot tea with lemon, this cheap, recycled meal felt like a luxurious weekend delicacy that brought the whole family rushing to the kitchen table. We cannot speak of the 1970s without honoring the incredible poppy seed pasta or makos testa. This dish was deeply intertwined with the physical labor of love. Every Hungarian kitchen had a heavy, cast-iron poppy seed grinder clamped tightly to the edge of the table. As children, turning that handle was a true test of strength and endurance. The mechanical crunching sound of the tiny, stubborn seeds breaking down was the soundtrack to our anticipation. We would grind the seeds until they released their dark, earthy, aromatic oils, creating a damp, fragrant powder. This was then generously mixed with bright, white powdered sugar. Meanwhile, fresh, flat pasta was boiling vigorously on the stove. The moment the steaming hot, slippery pasta was drained, it was immediately tossed with the sweet poppy seed mixture. The heat melted the sugar and bound the dark seeds to the pale noodles, creating a beautiful chaotic contrast of colors. Eating it was a delightfully messy affair. Our teeth and lips would inevitably become stained black with the tiny seeds, leading to endless giggles and wide comical smiles across the dinner table. It was a remarkably cheap, meatless meal that provided massive amounts of calories and pure, unadulterated joy. Sometimes the absolute best meals required absolutely no cooking at all. Let us remember the pure innocence of bread with butter and sugar, or vahaskenyér cukorral. This was the ultimate, quintessential afternoon snack for kids playing outside in the neighborhood. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when our energy began to dip from climbing trees and riding bicycles, we would dash back into the house, letting the screen door slam loudly behind us. We would beg our mothers for something sweet. With no money for store-bought chocolate or fancy candies, they would simply cut a fresh slice of bread. They would spread a thick, generous layer of soft, yellow butter across it, making sure it reached all the way to the very edges. Then came the magical part. They would take the sugar bowl and heavily dust the buttered bread with coarse, granulated white sugar. We would run back outside, eating it on the go. The sensation was unforgettable. The soft bread, the rich creamy butter, and the loud, satisfying crunch of the sugar crystals grinding between our teeth. It was a masterpiece of frugal parenting, providing an instant sugar rush and a feeling of profound care, entirely out of ingredients that were always waiting in the pantry. Now let us remember the morning rush before school, forever associated with the iconic yellow tin of matzikave and a fresh crescent roll or kifli. Real coffee beans were expensive and often difficult to find, but chicory coffee was a staple in every single Hungarian home. The tin, decorated with a friendly brown bear, held a powdery mixture that smelled earthy, malted, and slightly bitter. Our mothers would boil milk and stir in a spoonful of this chicory powder, sweetening it generously with sugar. It created a warm, caramel-colored beverage that was entirely caffeine-free, making it perfectly safe for us children to drink. But the ritual was never complete without the kifli. This pale, curved bread roll, lightly dusted with a touch of flour, was bought fresh early in the morning. We would sit sleepily at the table, tearing the ends off the kifli and dunking them deep into the hot, sweet chicory coffee. We had to perfectly time the dunking process. If you left it in too long, the soggy bread would break off and fall into the mug, ruining the experience. If you pulled it out just in time, it was a warm, melting, sweet delight that prepared us to face the cold walk to school. As we move into the colder months, we must honor the soup of absolute poverty that somehow tasted exactly like a warm, loving hug. The cumin seed soup, known as rantot leves. When the pantry was bare and the winter dew seeped through the walls, this soup was a true miracle of survival. The preparation started with simply melting a little fat in a pot. Into this hot fat, flour and whole caraway seeds were added and stirred constantly until they toasted into a beautiful golden brown paste. The nutty, earthy aroma that filled the kitchen during this step is a scent that immediately transports any Hungarian back to their childhood. Once the flour was perfectly toasted, cold water was whisked in, creating a thin, flavorful broth. Sometimes, if the chickens had been generous, a single beaten egg was slowly dropped into the boiling liquid, instantly cooked into delicate, savory ribbons. We would serve this incredibly cheap soup over cubes of stale, leftover bread toasted on the stove. The crunchy bread would soak up the warm, cumin-scented broth, expanding and softening. It was a masterclass in making something extraordinary out of absolutely nothing. Another cornerstone of our frugal existence was the mighty potato stew with paprika, simply known as paprika skrumpli. This was a dish deeply connected to the rhythm of the seasons and the outdoors. In the summer or early autumn, the preparation often began in the yard, sitting on low wooden stools with a bucket of water, peeling mounds of cheap, earth-scented potatoes. The base of the stew was the holy trinity of Hungarian cooking: melted fat, finely diced onions cooked until translucent, and a heavy, daring spoonful of bright red sweet paprika. The peeled, cubed potatoes were thrown into this vibrant red base, stirred to coat them completely, and then covered with just enough water to let them simmer. We would cook it slowly, patiently, until the edges of the potatoes began to break down, naturally thickening the sauce into a rich, velvety gravy. If it was the beginning of the month and there was a little money to spare, a tiny piece of smoky, spicy dried sausage was sliced into the pot. But very often, it was just the potatoes. We ate it from deep, chipped porcelain plates, using thick slices of white bread to mop up every last drop of the glorious red sauce. Let us take a moment to smile as we remember the sheer joy of sweet tomato soup with alphabet pasta, paradicsom leves betűtésztával. This was not the savory, herbaceous tomato soup known in the West. This was a distinctly sweet, deeply comforting Hungarian creation. In the late summer, our families would spend days boiling down massive cauldrons of fresh tomatoes, canning the thick, rich juice in large glass jars for the winter. To make the soup, this concentrated juice was simply thinned with water, seasoned with a pinch of salt, and heavily sweetened with several spoonfuls of sugar. But the true excitement lay hidden beneath the surface of the red liquid. The tiny pale alphabet pasta letters. We would eagerly plunge our spoons into the deep plates, carefully retrieving the little letters and arranging them meticulously on the rim of the bowl. We would spend 20 minutes just trying to spell out our own names or writing secret, silly messages to our siblings across the table, all while the soup slowly cooled down. It was a brilliantly cheap way to combine nourishment with endless childhood entertainment. We must also talk about the rustic beauty of browned egg barley, universally known and loved as tarhonia. This was not something you simply bought in a plastic bag at a brightly lit supermarket. Making tarhonia was a massive communal summer event. Grandmothers would mix a stiff, unforgiving dough of flour and eggs, and then spend hours grating it by hand into tiny, irregular little pearls. These pearls were then spread out on clean white linen tablecloths in the hot summer sun to dry completely, storing the warmth of the season for the cold winter months. When it was time to cook it, the ritual was beautiful. The dried pearls were first toasted in a generous spoonful of fat in a wide pan. We stood at the stove, stirring constantly, watching as the pale yellow pieces slowly transformed into various shades of golden brown, resembling beautiful tiny pebbles. Only then was water added, causing the pan to hiss and steam violently. It was cooked until the water was absorbed and the tarhonia became soft, fluffy, and incredibly nutty in flavor. Eaten simply with onions or a side of pickles, it was a filling, magnificent testament to the value of hard work and preparation. When the summer heat was at its peak and the gardens were absolutely overflowing with produce, our diets shifted to the glorious, vibrant pepper and tomato stew known as lecho. During July and August, when bell peppers and tomatoes were practically given away for free by neighbors with large gardens, lecho was on the table at least twice a week. The smell of pale yellow wax peppers and heavy, ripe, juicy red tomatoes simmering together in a large pot is the defining fragrance of a Hungarian summer. The vegetables were cooked down slowly until they collapsed into a rich, oily, incredibly flavorful stew. The skins of the tomatoes would curl up and the peppers would become meltingly tender. Sometimes an egg was scrambled into the mixture at the very end to stretch it further and add a bit of protein. But the most important part of eating lecho was the bread. You needed incredibly thick, fresh slices to dip into the bowl, acting as an edible sponge to soak up the magnificent, orange-colored oil that pooled at the edges. It was a messy, sweaty, incredibly satisfying meal that celebrated the humble bounty of the earth. Let us move to a dish that perfectly highlights our ability to make do with what the countryside offered. The deeply traditional curd cheese pasta, or turoszczusa. This dish is a masterclass in contrasting textures and temperatures. We started with flat, white pasta squares, boiled until soft and yielding. The heart of the dish was the distinct, crumbly, slightly sour Hungarian curd cheese known as turo. This was not the smooth, watery cottage cheese of the West, but a dry, flavorful cheese made from soured milk. We would mix the hot, steaming pasta generously with the cold, crumbled cheese. Then came a massive, unapologetic dollop of thick, rich, cold sour cream, creating a beautiful temperature contrast in every single bite. And if the family had just butchered a pig, or if there was a little extra cash, the crowning glory was added. Tiny, crispy, salty cubes of fried smoked bacon scattered over the top like precious jewels. The smoky fat from the bacon mixed with the cool sour cream and the warm pasta, creating a flavor profile so complex and comforting that you completely forgot how inexpensive the ingredients truly were. Another magical transformation of incredibly cheap ingredients was the semolina pasta with apricot jam, affectionately known as grizes testa. This is a dish that sounds incredibly strange to anyone who did not grow up in our region, but to us it was pure, unadulterated comfort. The secret was in the careful toasting of the semolina. We would place the dry grains in a pan, heating them slowly until they released a warm, deeply nutty aroma, turning a beautiful shade of toasted gold. Then a small splash of water was quickly added, making the pan hiss, and the semolina was covered to steam and fluff up. This crumbly, golden mixture was then tossed with hot, freshly cooked pasta. It was remarkably filling, but quite dry on its own. The absolute best part of the ritual was reaching into the pantry for a hidden glass jar of homemade apricot jam. We would drop an enormous sticky spoonful of the vibrant orange jam right into the center of the hot pasta, mixing the sweet, slightly tart fruit preserve into the nutty, savory semolina created a sticky, delightful mess that felt like eating dessert for a main course. We absolutely cannot forget the joy of homemade fried dough, the legendary langos. Now, I am not talking about the massive cheese and sour cream laden versions you buy at the modern Christmas markets today. I am talking about the simple, rustic version our grandmothers made at home on bread baking days. Whenever dough was needed for the weekly loaves of bread, a small portion was always secretly set aside for the children. This leftover dough was pinched off, stretched by hand into uneven, slightly torn circles, and immediately dropped into a deep pan of fiercely hot, bubbling oil. It puffed up instantly, forming large, golden brown blisters on the surface. We would pull them out, dangerously hot to the touch, and let the excess oil drip away. There was no expensive cheese to put on top. Instead, we used a small brush or a goose feather to generously paint the hot dough with a mixture of crushed raw garlic, water, and salt. The strong, pungent garlic water soaked into the crispy, oily crevices of the dough. Standing in the kitchen, passing the hot langos from hand to hand to avoid burning our fingers, we experienced a level of culinary bliss that money simply could not buy. Let us take a trip back to the noisy, crowded school hallways during the 10-minute morning recess. The classic school lunch was always a simple water roll with a squeeze of red paprika paste, known universally as wizes ziemle, with piroż arań. The water roll was the cheapest bakery item available, a simple, round, incredibly light bread roll with a thin crust and an airy inside. Our mothers would slice it perfectly in half. In times when real butter or cold cuts were entirely out of the question due to the tight household budget, they relied on a brilliant Hungarian invention. The iconic metal tube of piroż araň, which translates to red gold. This was a deeply salty, vibrant red paste made from crushed paprika peppers. A thick, red zigzag line of this salty paste was squeezed onto the dry bread, and the two halves were pressed firmly back together. When the school bell rang for recess, we would sit on the wooden benches, pulling these slightly squished, red-stained rolls from our cloth napkins. The intense, salty kick of the paprika paste, combined with the plain bread, was enough to silence our rumbling stomachs until we could run home for a proper afternoon meal. As the week progressed towards the weekend, families often relied on the spectacular layered potatoes, or rakot krumpli, to feed a large crowd on a very tight budget. This was a masterpiece constructed in an old, heavily chipped enamel baking dish. The process required time, but very little money. We would boil a large pot of unpeeled potatoes and another smaller pot of eggs. Once everything was cooled and peeled, the meticulous layering process began. A layer of thinly sliced potatoes, seasoned generously with salt. A layer of sliced hard-boiled eggs, and then a massive, thick spreading of rich, tangy sour cream. This process was repeated until the dish was filled to the absolute brim. If there was a small piece of dried sausage in the pantry, thin slices were tucked between the layers to flavor the whole dish, but it was magnificent even without it. The dish was baked in the hot oven until the top layer of sour cream bubbled, reduced, and formed a beautiful golden brown crust. Cutting into it revealed perfectly distinct layers. It was a heavy, warm, incredibly satisfying feast made entirely from the humblest, cheapest ingredients found in the dark, cool cellar. During the long, incredibly dark and freezing winter evenings, when the wind rattled the window panes, we found warmth and comfort in the simplest dessert imaginable: baked apples, or sultalma. By January, the apples stored in the cold cellar had often lost their fresh, crisp snap. Their skins became slightly wrinkled, and they were no longer perfect for eating raw. But our grandmothers knew exactly how to resurrect them. The apples were carefully cored, placed snugly side by side in a small baking tin, and slid into the hot oven of the kitchen stove. Sometimes, if we were very lucky, a tiny pinch of precious cinnamon or a single drop of sticky honey was placed in the hollow center of each apple. But most of the time, they were simply baked plain. The heat of the oven worked a slow miracle. The apples would eventually collapse, their skins bursting open to reveal the soft, fragrant, steaming flesh inside. The entire house would fill with the deeply comforting smell of baked fruit. Sitting near the warm tile stove, eating the soft, sweet, mushy apple with a small spoon, we felt completely safe, warm, and perfectly content in our small, protected world. When spring finally arrived, bringing a sense of renewal to the grey world, our diet shifted slightly. A classic, quick, and incredibly cheap meal was egg dumplings, accompanied by a simple lettuce salad. We called it tojasos no kedli. The dumpling batter was nothing more than flour, water, a pinch of salt, and a single egg mixed vigorously until thick and sticky. This batter was then scraped through a metal grater directly into a large pot of violently boiling water. The tiny, irregular dumplings would cook in seconds, floating to the top like little clouds. They were quickly strained and immediately thrown into a hot pan with a little melted fat and several beaten eggs. The eggs scrambled around the hot dumplings, coating them in a rich, savory blanket. But the absolute key to this dish was the side salad. Simple, soft spring lettuce leaves drenched in a dressing made purely of water, vinegar, and sugar. The sharp, sweet, and sour bite of the vinegar water cut perfectly through the heavy, rich, egg-coated dumplings. It was a celebration of the changing seasons, a bright, filling meal that required very little time and almost zero financial investment. And finally, I promised you a sweet, snowy white miracle at the end of our journey. The ultimate expression of love, the dessert that made us feel like absolute royalty despite our empty pockets. Floating islands, known beautifully in Hungarian as modarte, which translates to bird's milk. The ingredients were the absolute basics of a rural life: milk, eggs, sugar, and a single precious packet of vanilla sugar. The egg whites were whipped with absolute fury by hand until they formed stiff, glossy, snowy peaks. Large spoonfuls of this cloud-like foam were gently dropped into a white pot of simmering sweetened milk. The egg whites poached softly, expanding into magnificent floating white islands. They were carefully lifted out, and the egg yolks, mixed with more sugar and vanilla, were slowly whisked into the remaining hot milk, thickening it into a rich, golden yellow custard. The snowy islands were then set gently afloat on this golden sea. Served cold from the refrigerator on a Sunday afternoon, it was incredibly elegant, delicate, and deeply sweet. It cost virtually nothing to make, yet it felt like a magical, luxurious gift that wrapped up our weekends in pure happiness. When we look back at these 20 humble dishes, we realize a profound truth. We do not just miss the taste of the toasted caraway seeds or the sharp bite of the purple onion on fat bread. What we truly, deeply ache for is the feeling of that time. We miss our youth, the unhurried pace of the days, and the absolute certainty that no matter how little money we had, we were safe, loved, and surrounded by family in that tiny, warm kitchen. Those cheap meals nourished our bodies, but the love and resourcefulness of the women who cooked them nourished our very souls. If this journey back to the 1970s brought a warm smile to your face or a nostalgic tear to your eye, please subscribe to our channel and like this video, so we can continue to preserve these precious memories together. Now, I want to ask you, my friend, which of these 20 classic frugal meals brings back the absolute strongest, most vivid memory of your own childhood? Please tell me your beautiful stories in the comments below. I would be truly honored to read them.